For
the last several decades, the so-called new atheists have been winning converts to their religion. Welcome to Know the Word, Live the Word. This is Chris Bender.
Thanks, Chris.
For the last several decades, the so-called new atheists have been winning converts to their religion by banging the drum of reason.
Hey! Hostile work environment.
Hey all, Dave here. I came across a video this morning from an atheist responding to a video from a Christian. The video was from a channel called Dark of All Trades, and they were responding to a video called Are Scientifically Educated Atheists Extinct? Admittedly, I haven't watched the whole of the Dark of All Trades video yet. The few clips I saw though made me think it might make for a nice quick and easy response video. I'll go back to Dark of All Trades video after making my own though, and I suggest you do the same too. You'll find a link to that video in the description below. Dark of All Trades also has a low subscriber count, so go give the channel a subscription and help them out. The video we'll be looking at here is Are Scientifically Educated Atheists Extinct? From a channel called Know the Word, Live the Word. It's an apologetics channel, unsurprisingly. The video also makes some pretty questionable claims, which I thought might be interesting to look at. You've already seen one of the claims, the claim that new atheists have been recruiting people to their religion over the last couple of decades. It's probably pretty easy to guess my view of that, but I thought I'd flesh out a response, along with a response to some of the other things that Chris Bender, the person in the video, claims. Let's start first with the claim that we saw at the very beginning of the video, that new atheists have been converting people to their religion for decades. Most atheists will have heard this line at some point. It pops up quite a lot, as we can see from these recent examples on screen. Not all Christians or atheists in general make the argument that atheism is a religion. More informed believers steer clear of this argument. There are no theists that I personally know who use this argument, though as we can see from the tweets on screen, it's popular enough where there are several common responses to this argument from atheists. These responses are pretty easily found on places like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, so I won't go into detail about them here. There is one common response that I'll focus on though. Often when a theist argues that atheism is a religion, atheists will argue that it doesn't fit the definition of being a religion, usually posting a dictionary definition like the one you see on screen now. This one was just the first that popped up in the Google search results. However, they are all pretty consistent across all dictionaries, as you can see from this entry in the Cambridge Online Dictionary. Dictionaries usually contain one description that talks about religion being the belief in and worship of a god or gods or any such system of belief, and another description that talks about religion being an activity that someone is extremely enthusiastic about and does regularly. The first one is talking about something like Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, and that kind of thing. The second one is talking about using the term in the sense of he follows his favorite team religiously or she exercises religiously. We'll take a look at both of these ideas in the video, though before we move on, let's just address the comment about new atheists winning converts to their religion by banging the drum of reason. Comments like this do apologists no favors. These sort of comments also do no favors to other Christians or other believers in general. When apologists like Chris make a comment like this, they sound as if they are showing disdain for the idea that atheists and skeptics promote the use of reason, especially in the case of someone like Chris here, who does not expand on or clarify what the problem is with atheists and skeptics banging the drum of reason. All this does is further solidify the common stereotype that believers are against the use of reason. Comments like atheism is a religion also further fuel that stereotype. It's not just atheists and skeptics that bang the drum of reason though. There are plenty of theists that also bang the drum of reason. While there will no doubt be many of my fellow atheists that argue here that all theists are irrational, and some atheists and skeptics will argue that theists are delusional, there are lots that argue for the use of reason when it comes to religious beliefs. Of course, there are plenty of believers and apologists like Chris here. There's people like Frank Turek, Ray Comfort, Ken Ham, Kent Hovind, Eric Hovind, Matt Powell, Christ Righteous Ministries, Zakir Naik, and way too many to mention. There is no shortage of people making terrible arguments for whatever flavor of theism we care to mention. But there is also no shortage of believers making good arguments for whatever flavor of theism we care to mention also. We have John Buck, Ocean Keltoy, Kenny Pierce, Dry Apologist, Thought Adventure Podcast, Randall Rouser, Exploring Reality, Dustin Crummett, and many, many more. Lots of atheists will disagree with me here, of course, but the people mentioned promote the use of reason and the use of good arguments to support belief in gods. There is an element of faith included too, of course. Such is the nature of belief in gods. What is important is that they too bang the drum of reason to call people to their religions. Actual religions, unlike Chris's faulty claim about atheism being a religion. When it comes to wanting our beliefs to be reasonable and to be rational, most theists are little different to atheists and skeptics. There are very few people that set out to have unreasonable and irrational beliefs. Even people that believe in the flat earth think that their beliefs are reasoned and rational. They too bang the drum of reason, even if they're using a broken drumstick. The same could be said of many skeptics and atheists, though. A glance through the comment section of some of my videos will show that even though skeptics and atheists bang the drum of reason, the ability to bang a drum does not always a drummer make. Let's move on from this for now, though.
Make no mistake, atheism is a type of religion that requires more faith than anyone now could reasonably have.
Why are you doing this?
Chris once again argues that atheism is a religion, though this time declaring it to be a type of religion rather than a religion itself. Also adding that atheism requires more faith than anyone now can reasonably have. I do already have a video on the topic of atheism requiring faith. A card for that video should be popping up somewhere right about now, and a link for it will be in the description for anyone who wants to watch it. Later on in Chris's video, he argues for this claim in slightly more detail though, so we'll be covering that when the time comes. The same cannot be said of his claim that atheism is a type of religion though, unfortunately. Not once in the video does Chris support this claim, or most of the other claims he makes in the video, nor does he support them in the comment section, even though a few people did actually bring this point up. Instead of responding to the questions about that assertion, Chris responds by pointing out that it is not the point of the video. The point of this video is instead to promote the idea that as we do not know the origins of the universe, we should be agnostic rather than an atheist. As mentioned later in his video, he focuses on arguments for why it takes faith to be an atheist, considering what science tells us in today's times. These arguments are also used as the reasons for why we should be agnostic rather than atheist. So while the idea that atheism is a religion is not the focus of the video, or argued for in the video and comment section, it's still worth addressing quickly. We'll do that, and then we'll return to the arguments about atheism, faith, and why we should be agnostic instead of atheist. This should be a pretty easy section, as it's not difficult to show that atheism does not fit the bill of how we generally see a religion. We'll do what most atheists and skeptics do when confronted by this claim. We'll start by looking at the dictionary definition of religion from the Cambridge Online Dictionary again, which should be on screen. As we can see, the first usage listed is the belief in and worship of a god or gods, or any such system of belief and worship. It's pretty obvious from this that atheism does not fit the bill of this usage. Atheism comes in two main flavors: non-belief in god or gods, and the belief that God does not exist. For those interested, I have a video titled Atheism, A Tale of Two Usages that can be checked out. A link to it should be in the description of the video, and a card for it on screen about now. The problem with trying to align atheism with this usage is immediately apparent. There is no belief in any gods when it comes to either flavor of atheism. One of the flavors, strong atheism, even goes as far as being the belief that God does not exist. Of course, not all religions involve belief in gods, which is why system of belief and worship is also mentioned. This part is not fulfilled by any flavor of atheism either. While While many theists like Chris might like to argue that it is a belief system, honest reflection and thought shows it's not. In the case of weak atheism, it simply describes a psychological state. It describes non-belief in God. In the case of strong atheism, it describes a single belief. It describes an agent's attitude towards the proposition God exists. Strong atheism contains nothing on metaphysics or ethics or views of the afterlife or anything else. It is simply the belief that God does not exist. We can argue that it's also a collection of counter-apologetics and counter-arguments for the existence of God, but there is no belief system there in the sense that we would generally think of a belief system. That usage was pretty easy to dismiss, but what of the second usage? The second usage listed is an activity that someone is extremely enthusiastic about and does regularly. As stated at the beginning of the video, we can see this usage in action with terms like he watches soap operas religiously and she arrives at 8 a.m. religiously for work. In this sense, it's not used to refer to something that somebody treats like a religion. It refers to a kind of zealousness, not a kind of religiosity, meaning that atheism in and of itself cannot fit this description. This definition refers to people's actions, not a label like atheism. One could make a tenuous argument like he promotes atheism religiously, speaking of the enthusiasm of an agent promoting atheism, but that wouldn't make atheism a religion in and of itself though, not even in a personal sense. There are those believers that argue things like atheists worship sin and that kind of thing, just so that they can make an incredibly tenuous link from atheism to religion. Who cares though? There's little point in arguing with those people, and they care little if what they are saying is true. Anything we argue to try to convince them that atheism is not a religion or a type of religion will fall on deaf ears. The argument they're making is one born of ideology rather than reason. The better informed and more honest believers do not make the argument that atheism is a religion, as they know and understand that it's not. It could be argued here that when it comes to defining religion, it isn't quite as simple as pointing out the dictionary definition, or pointing out how people generally see religion, and I agree. When it comes to scholars of the subject of religion, there is no universally accepted definition of religion, meaning that there is no academic answer to the question of whether atheism could count as a religion. However, I'd argue that this would be giving Chris and other apologists and believers that make this claim too much credit. They aren't basing their reasoning and arguments on this. There are some comments that I want to make about the idea of atheists treating atheism as if it is a religion, but I'll save that for another time in video. Let's get back to Chris's video instead, and look at his reasoning for why atheism requires more faith than anyone can now reasonably have.
You see, up to the 20th century, most scientists had concluded that the universe was eternal, meaning they believed the universe never had a beginning.
Chris talks here about the prevailing view from scientists up to the 20th century being that the universe was eternal and without beginning. There are some challenges that could be made, but for the sake of argument, let's just accept what Chris says here is true. Going into lengthy detail about the history of what philosophers and scientists believed about the universe would add unnecessary runtime. While it would definitely be an interesting detour, the argument that Chris follows this with doesn't rely on the history of what was believed. Chris's argument focuses on what is currently believed and known about the universe. It's also this part of the argument that we're really interested in and want to explore. However, before moving on, I just want to plug another YouTuber's channel here. While I could respond to the claim about the history of what scientists used to believe about the beginning of the universe, it's really not my area. My knowledge of the history of cosmology and just cosmology in general is pretty weak, especially when compared to some other people, and most definitely when compared to Leo Filius. When I want to learn about topics like this, Leo is my go-to channel. He's also very underrated and criminally undersubbed. If you're interested in science and cosmology, then I highly recommend subscribing to and binging on Leo's content. A card for his channel should have popped up by now, and I'll also leave a link in the description, so go and watch and subscribe now, or at the end of my video at least.
Well, with the growth of modern science, and with significantly more research, it has been definitively confirmed that the universe did have a beginning.
What you talking about, Willis?
The claim that Chris makes here is something of a bold one. Has the universe definitively been confirmed as having a beginning? I would imagine that what Chris is speaking about here is the Big Bang. The idea that the universe began as a singularity, then expansion happened, and our universe began to form, thus showing that our universe had a beginning. Does it really show that the universe definitively had a beginning though? Not exactly. I don't want to spend too much time on this for a couple of reasons. One reason is that this topic has been covered many times by people much more brilliant and knowledgeable than I am, so it would be reinventing the wheel to go over them in great detail. Instead, I'll just point you towards some resources for looking into this. Another reason is the most interesting parts of Chris's argument come after this. For now though, I'll just mention a couple of things. The first thing to quickly mention here is the question, what do we mean by the universe? When scientists speak of the universe having a beginning, what they're generally referring to is the observable universe. They are speaking of the universe as we know it. Most are not speaking of it in terms of the start of all space and time, which means that if we consider the universe to be all-encompassing of time, space, and all existing matter, then the Big Bang and science do not definitively prove that the universe had a beginning, just that our observable universe had a beginning. The other thing to quickly mention here is the idea of eternalism. According to these, all moments of time, past, present, and future, are all equally real and all exist. The me that is finishing this script already exists, and the moment is already real, as is the moment when I release the video and the moment of you already finishing it. These moments will not come to exist or come into being, they already exist and already have being. Under eternalism or the B theory of time, the universe did not begin to exist, which means that under these theories of time, the universe did not have a beginning and did not begin to exist. Scientists and philosophers tend to lean towards eternalism or B theory of time, as it generally fits with general and special relativity, though there are criticisms of both theories of time. So as we can see, Chris's claim that the universe had a beginning being definitively confirmed is a stretching of the facts somewhat. The truth is that while the Big Bang theory shows that our observable universe had a beginning, there are still questions about what existed before that, or whether anything existed before that, and just what the nature of time and being is. The channel I mentioned earlier, Leophilius, has a lot of great information with regards to this. There is also a link in the description to a video from Majesty of Reason titled New Objections to the Kalam Still Work. Premise 2 of the Kalam cosmological argument is about the universe coming into existence, and objections to that premise are incredibly useful and helpful against Chris's assertion here.
But here's the clincher. All the scientific data points to the universe being created out of nothing.
Lies! Lies and slander!
One last bit before we get into the actual meat and potatoes of Chris's argument. Here we see him assert that all of the scientific data points towards the universe being created out of nothing. As usual though, he presents no actual data to back up this claim. He just mentions that it's a clincher. The problem is that science does not definitively show that there was nothing before the universe, especially in the sense of the philosophical nothing. Perhaps what Chris is speaking of here is Lawrence Krauss's work A Universe from Nothing. If it is, then I can only suggest that he did not read the book past the title or the blurb on the back. Or he is equivocating when he argues that science proves the universe came from nothing, and the kind of nothing that someone like Krauss is speaking of, as Krauss is not speaking of the philosophical nothing. It's also somewhat ironic, as Krauss is arguing for a godless start to the universe, and arguing that God is not necessary for the universe to come from nothing. But it's here where we get to what Chris states is the point of the video. As you probably argued yourself in the past, we just don't know what came before the Big Bang. We saw this appear in one of the screenshots used earlier in the video, this one in fact. As stated in the Forbes article, when it comes to the universe having a beginning, we just aren't sure. Science just isn't sure. The same could be said of what came before the Big Bang. We can guess, we can theorize in the colloquial sense, have fun discussions, and write cool sci-fi about it. But at the end of the day, we just aren't sure. Which, according to Chris, means that we should be agnostics rather than atheists. Up next is his argument in support of this, and the part of the argument that I've been looking forward to discussing.
So can anyone truly be an educated, honest atheist?
Yes, thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
With science pointing to the universe being created out of nothing.
As already mentioned, science doesn't point to the universe being created out of nothing.
Wouldn't that make those who prefer God not to exist agnostics? Meaning they just don't know how the universe got here.
Notice the loaded language that's slipped in here. Chris uses the phrase, prefer God not to exist. While there are those that argue that they hope God does not exist, most atheists aren't atheists because they would prefer God did not exist. Depending on the form of atheism in question, they either believe God doesn't exist or they just don't believe in God. So just as Chris is misrepresenting the conclusions of science, so too is he misrepresenting why people are atheists, which will become something of a trend along with the loaded language. He asks if science confirming the universe comes from nothing would make them agnostics instead of atheists. Even if we were to accept this claim that science confirms that the universe came from nothing, that still wouldn't determine whether we are agnostic or atheist. As mentioned, what makes us atheist or agnostic depends on the definition of atheism in question and our attitude towards the claim that God exists. Perhaps what Chris meant to say here is that shouldn't this mean that we should remain agnostic, rather than wouldn't this make us agnostic instead of atheist? There's still a faulty premise going on here though. That premise being if science has proven the universe came from nothing, then we should remain agnostic about the existence of God. As stated multiple times, science has not proven any such thing, and instead points to us simply not knowing what was there before the universe. A better and far more honest question from Chris here would have been, since we don't know where the universe came from, shouldn't we remain agnostic about God?
Since all that we see developed from nothing, how can anyone truly say there can't be a God?
So here we can see Chris ask how people can say that there can't be a God when we know that everything developed from nothing. And once again we see him springboard from the faulty premise that we know everything developed from nothing. I have yet to meet a fellow atheist that argues that everything came from nothing though. Just as I have yet to see science argue that everything came from nothing. At least nothing in the sense that Chris is using it in the video. Like I mentioned in a previous section, Lawrence Krauss argues for a universe from nothing. One could attempt to argue here that maybe Chris is using it in the same sense that Krauss is, but as I already mentioned, Krauss argues for a godless beginning. Well, Chris is arguing that if the universe came from nothing, then we can't say that God can't exist or doesn't exist, meaning that Chris cannot be speaking about the same coming from nothing that Krauss is. It should be noted here also that there is a distinction to be made between those who hold to strong atheism and those who hold to weak atheism. A strong atheist believes God does not exist, and a weak atheist simply does not believe God exists. The weak atheist simply thinks that the case for God isn't strong enough to push them over from doubt to belief in God, while the strong atheist believes that evidence points towards God's non-existence. A weak atheist would be considered agnostic in the paradigm that Chris is using. They just happen to use the label atheist, preferring that label to agnostic for whatever reason makes them prefer it. In the case of the strong atheist, there are those that do argue that God cannot exist. This is usually based off various things they believe about the universe as well as the conception of God. Something that Chris seems to ignore here, and something important. For most people, it is the concept of God that is presented to them that makes them believe it doesn't or cannot exist. For the sake of argument, let's accept Chris's claim that it has already been proven that the universe came from nothing. He mentions the Bible is consistent with that, with the Bible claiming that God created the universe from nothing. Here we would have a data point that correlates between the God presented and how the universe seems to be. According to Chris, this means we should remain undecided about God based on this single data point. The problem is that this ignores all the other ways that God is defined. Chris is a Christian, which means that God isn't just defined as a being that created the universe out of nothing. God is defined as all-loving, all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly just, and many other things. Chris ignores that many of the arguments for atheism are based on these things that are argued about God. For example, the problem of teleological evil doesn't depend on God creating the universe out of nothing. It depends on God being an all-good God and God being the designer of the universe. We could grant that science has proven that the universe came out of the philosophical nothing, and it would do nothing to affect an argument like this. Nor does it do anything to affect an argument like divine hiddenness, or most of the other arguments for atheism. Meaning that even if we were to accept that science has proven the universe came from the philosophical nothing, it does not mean that there are no other arguments for atheism, and that those arguments, when put in its cumulative case, cannot tip us over into the belief that God does not exist.
No honest person who isn't fooling themselves believes that anything can come from nothing.
You serious?
Chris says no honest person would fool themselves into believing that anything can come from nothing. But atheists aren't fooling themselves into believing that the universe came from nothing. I don't believe the universe came from nothing, and I don't know any other atheists that believe the universe came from nothing. If Chris was to spend any amount of time speaking to atheists or looking at what atheists say, then he would quickly find this out. It's not that atheists believe something came from nothing, it's that there are lots of theists that believe that atheists believe something comes from nothing. We can kind of turn this around though. Let's say instead that no honest person would fool themselves into believing that atheists believe something can come from nothing. Or no honest person would fool themselves into believing that science has proven the universe comes from nothing. Or no honest person would fool themselves into believing that atheists are atheists because they would prefer God not to exist. Or no honest person would fool themselves into believing that atheism is a religion. Or no honest person would, well, you get the picture. As I mentioned earlier, there were a couple of YouTube comments left by Chris under his video in response to some comments left for him. In them, he explains that the point of the video was to argue that it would be more appropriate for atheists in general to identify as agnostic. As we have no reasonable explanation for how the universe got here, it becomes a matter of faith and a manner of religion to reject any possibility of a supernatural explanation. One problem I have with this is that there is a certain amount of emotional manipulation going on here. One that we also see replicated in the atheist community from atheists pushing the lack of belief in God's definition too. Chris most likely knows that many people in the atheist community see faith and religion in any form as something worthy only of disdain. By promoting the idea that believing God does not exist is a matter of faith and involves a manner of religion, this will cause many atheists to recoil from the idea and avoid adopting that position, especially when there are also fellow atheists and skeptics arguing the same thing. In reality, though, there is no manner of religion involved in believing that God does not exist. There is no ritual involved, and there is no supernatural entity involved, and there is no worship involved. There is nothing in believing God does not exist that resembles religiosity in any form. The same holds true where faith is concerned. It is not a matter of faith to believe that God does not exist, even if we do not know for certain how the universe came to be, and even if we cannot know for certain that God does not exist. The belief that God does not exist, especially the God that Chris believes in and promotes, does not rely on knowing how the universe came to be. Chris also mentions that absolute certainty that God couldn't be the cause of the universe is a statement of faith, not a fact of science that can be empirically proven. And this might be true if the statement was something along the lines of a God God rather than God. But Chris is not speaking of some vaguely defined creator being. Chris is speaking of the God that he promotes and believes in. Chris is speaking of the Christian God. That one takes a little less faith. Of course, Chris never actually defines what he means by faith here. So he could simply be speaking of faith in the sense of trust, meaning that what he's saying is that to have absolute certainty that his God did not create the universe involves us trusting our belief and our arguments and our reasoning, which is true. It does take a level of trust in our reasoning and our arguments and our conclusions and our beliefs. But the same would be true if we had empirical data from science that proved that God couldn't be the cause of the universe. It would take a level of trust in the scientific findings and our ability to understand them and our reasoning and many other things. But I don't think that's the kind of faith that Chris is talking about here. However, if someone like Chris wants to argue that it's a form of faith, well, fine by me. If that's what he wants to call it, then it makes no difference to my actual belief. The word faith isn't something that I fear or have disdain for. Throwing that word at me doesn't make me recoil in horror and make me worried about the conclusions I've come to. It doesn't change the fact that all the arguments and evidence seem to point towards a godless universe, at least for me anyway, especially when it comes to a god like the Christian God. The kind of emotional manipulation that Chris is attempting here doesn't really work on me. To further example the idea that Chris is attempting emotional manipulation with his statements, we need only look at the comment, "There are plenty of smart, honest agnostics." That choice of wording is an attempt to manipulate those who worry about being seen as honest and smart. By promoting the idea that it's only agnostics that are these things and not atheists, this plays on this fear. Though, to be fair to Chris, we also find this kind of thing going on from those who promote atheism as a lack of belief in God. They argue that it is irrational to believe God does not exist and that it is only rational to lack a belief in God. They too adopt much of the argumentation put forward by apologists like Chris here and do much of the same work that Chris is doing here. Of course, if Chris actually was interested in honesty and interested in promoting honesty, he wouldn't have made arguments like atheism is a religion and that science has proven the universe came from nothing. He also wouldn't be basing the main argument of his video, that we should remain agnostic, on the falsehood that science has proven the universe came from nothing. The title of Chris's video asks the question, are scientifically educated atheists extinct? To which we can only answer, no. There are plenty of scientifically educated atheists. Chris's argument is that atheism and scientifically educated are two things that simply do not go together. He argues that if atheists were truly scientifically educated, they would instead be agnostic. The fact that we do not definitively know the cause of the universe means that we should also be agnostic about God. After all, if we don't know for sure what caused the universe, then we can't rule out God as the cause. Of course, Chris also argues, somewhat contradictorily, that we also know that the universe was created out of nothing. Science tells us so. And as the idea of the universe being created out of nothing matches what the Bible tells us about the origins of the universe, then the smart and honest person will at the very least remain agnostic. The smart and honest person takes science into account, and even if they don't believe God exists, the science matches the Bible, and that means we should at least be open to the possibility of God being the cause of the universe. The problem with this argument is that, as we saw, science has proven no such thing. Science has not proven that the universe was created from nothing. What science says is that we don't know what caused the universe. So Chris's argument fails from the get-go, as it starts from a faulty premise. A premise that I'm willing to bet Chris knows is faulty, and I'm willing to also bet that he knows is a falsehood, which is ironic considering that Chris's entire argument is about how atheists ought to be honest. We also discussed Chris's claim that science has definitively proven that the universe had a beginning, which, while not being an outright falsehood, is also not telling the entire story. It is another case where science simply says we don't know. Most argue that it shows that the known universe had a beginning, but this does not mean that all all of space and time had a definitive beginning. Taking something like eternalism and the B theory of time into account adds in a further layer of we don't know. If those theories of time are true, then the universe did not come into existence and did not have a definitive beginning in the sense that we would think of it if presentism or the A theory of time were true. To these falsehoods and misrepresentations that Chris uses, we can also add the misrepresentations and falsehoods he uses about atheists, with him making claims like atheism being a religion and atheists preferring God not to exist rather than believing God does not exist, and that it takes faith to believe God does not exist. All of these falsehoods and misrepresentations leave me asking the question of who this video is for. Chris portrays the argument as one aimed at convincing atheists that they should be agnostic. The science itself dictates that we should remain open to the idea that God is the cause of the universe. So Chris clearly shows signs of knowing that atheists prefer to follow the science. Yet his entire argument is based on misrepresenting the science. If Chris knows enough to know that atheists like to base their beliefs on science, then he should know enough to know that most atheists also know what the science says. They know the basics of what it argues, and that it does not say that the universe was created from nothing. So again, who exactly is this video for? I also find it hard to believe that it's aimed at atheists because the video reinforces many of the stereotypes that many atheists have about Christians. It reinforces ideas like Christians being scientifically illiterate, and about Christians lying and misrepresenting science, and about them using emotionally manipulative tactics, and more. The video does a much better job of damaging the reputation of Christians and apologetics than anything I could put out. So again, who exactly is this video for? Chris asks the question, are scientifically educated atheists extinct? Let's turn the question around though. We'll ask the question, are honest apologists extinct? Looking at people like Chris, Frank Turek, Ray Comfort, Christ Righteous Ministries, Kent Hovind, Canned Ham, Matt Walsh, and many others, we would want to answer yes. We shouldn't be in too much of a rush to answer yes, though, as there are honest apologists out there. And just as there are atheists doing the work of apologists by arguing things like believing God does not exist is dishonest and irrational, people like Chris are doing the work of atheists by promoting arguments like this and pushing them away from this kind of Christianity and these kind of apologetics. Anyway, that's all for now. Thanks for listening. I'll be back with another video soon, and hopefully I can convince you to tune into that one. Take care. I hope your day goes well. Bye.